And today marks exactly 73 years since the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But now NATO is facing heavy criticism of its handling of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO was formed in 1949 when 12 countries agreed to come to each other's aid in the event of an armed attack. Of course, that was after the Second World War. There are now 30 NATO member countries. A country's membership of the alliance has to be approved by all current members. Ukraine wanted to join NATO, a move opposed by Russia. So how impactful is the organization in modern-day international relations? And by the way, why does Russia not want NATO on its doorsteps? Greg Mills is president of the Brentius Foundation, joining us now live from inside Ukraine. He finds himself in the town of Lviv, that's in the western part of Ukraine as you go towards Poland. Greg, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Welcome to today on ENCA. Is NATO making a lot of noise, a lot of celebration around its 73rd anniversary today, or is it all quiet?
Well, NATO is primarily a defensive alliance. It was established out of the ruins of the Second World War, a little bit like the European Economic Community, now the European Union, was as well. It was designed to find a way to bring about peace and stability in Europe. Of course, when the end of the Second World War morphed into the Cold War, NATO found itself up against the Warsaw Pact countries with the Soviet Union at the heart of it. And when the Cold War disappeared 30 years ago, so almost half of NATO's life, NATO itself changed and gradually expanded its membership, as you pointed out, from 12 to 30 members as the politics of the region changed. Now, Vladimir Putin likes to portray NATO as being the problem in the conflict in Ukraine, but really, frankly, Russia's the problem in the conflict in Ukraine. Russia has a problem with Ukraine's desire to look westwards. Ukraine wants to be like the countries of Western Europe. It doesn't want to be like Russia and the former Soviet states. It wants to reform. It wants, as you pointed out, to become a member of NATO, but probably more than that, wants to become a member of the European Union because of the economic benefits attached to closer integration. So the pretext for Russia, and in fact, I would say the political miscalculation that Vladimir Putin has made, is about really trying to impose a vision of a world of 30 years ago rather than a reality of a world today.
Has Russia wanted to join NATO before?
Not Russia. Ukraine has wanted to join NATO for some time. It's been in its constitution.
Yeah, no, I know. Sorry,
Greg.
Yeah, I know about Ukraine. I just wanted to establish if it was any time at all where the Russians might have been interested to join NATO and they were turned down.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, you know, Russia's always been diametrically opposed to NATO, which is why the Warsaw Pact came about. And it's certainly very hard to imagine now that you would see that eventuality, at least under the rule of Vladimir Putin.
So, why would Vladimir Putin have miscalculated so much with Ukraine wanting to join NATO, and he's finding it offensive and not comfortable, and hence using it, therefore, as an excuse to invade Ukraine?
Well, I think it's just a strategic miscalculation on his part because he understands Ukraine of 30 years ago, not Ukraine of today. He doesn't understand that Ukraine has been developing its economy, has been developing its democracy, and very critically has been developing its own sense of national identity as distinct from that of the former Soviet Union and of Russia in the 30 years of its statehood. And I think that he believed that this intervention would very quickly see Kiev capitulate, and at the same time would very quickly see the majority of Ukrainians support him. And quite the opposite has happened. It's not only just happened in Ukraine, it's also happened in the rest of the world because, as it is, the flagrant disregard of international law. So the strategic miscalculation is on a whole set of levels, not just in Ukraine, but also internationally.
Okay, let's look at NATO. It is their anniversary, hence we wanted to talk to you. How much impact, therefore, does NATO have today? I saw reports, I don't know if they are confirmed, that Finland might be joining NATO as well soon, although Russia is also uncomfortable about that. So how much does the NATO of today, in today's world, with its 30 members already, have?
Well, it has significant influence. It's a $1 trillion defense organization with considerable amount of defensive military capability, but also more than that, because military means are nothing by themselves. It has considerable political capability and economic weight behind it, because it really overlaps significantly with the European Union. Of course, it includes Canada and the United States in its membership. And as you quite rightly point out, I think recent developments have made NATO membership more likely, not less likely. And I think perhaps one of the big takeaways of the last several months have been that defense, which we saw really as being of decreasing importance in global politics, the sort of organizations like NATO perhaps being decreasingly relevant, of being Cold War relics, in fact, are as relevant today, maybe even more so than they were at the end of the Cold War, because countries still require those basic assurances, that fundamental platform of security in order to be able to prosper.
So Finland might be a new member, but now Ukraine pulling back from the last reports I saw. Are you aware of any change there as part maybe of trying to stop the hostilities that have been playing themselves out for more than a month now in their country, Ukraine seemingly pulling back from NATO?
Well, it may be part of a wider deal to be struck with Russia, that Ukraine will not now go for NATO membership as part of a peace deal. But a lot of other things would have to happen if it was going to give up that card at this junction. One of the things that would have to happen is that Russia would have to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. So, like any negotiation, there has to be a degree of give and take. And one of the cards to be played is NATO membership. Another card to be played, of course, is membership of the European Union, which in some respects is more important, given the need for rebuilding that's going to have to occur in Ukraine. But I think it would have been difficult 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War to see a long-term future for NATO. I think the remarkable thing is that the organization has changed, it's transformed its role, it has taken on even a greater political and security component, not just a military component. And I think this conflict in particular has given it a reason for relevance.
As an organization that's primarily in Europe and America, I mean, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization after all, and currently increasing its membership, even Finland coming on board. It's very much sounds like it's a military alliance for the rich, for the developed countries. In a world where more and more voices are calling for multilateralism and a recognition of poor countries like South Africa and continents like Africa, does NATO have a relevant role in a modern-day multilateral world where peace and dialogue should be fostered rather than using military might?
Well, you might well ask the same question about the African Union or any other regional military organization or economic organization as well. But I do take the point. This is about securing Europe primarily, based on what happened in the Second World War. And there's a range of security difficulties, many of them human security difficulties, developmental security difficulties, which happen elsewhere in the world. And one would certainly like to see, and it's been happening slowly, but I would argue at not nearly the sort of pace that's required, of NATO, among others, extending its activities, extending its training and other support regimes, support for peacekeeping, support for humanitarian assistance elsewhere in the world. There's a degree of resistance to this. There's people see the world still through a colonial and anti-colonial prism at times, but one would hope to see a sort of overarching security domain take place and establish itself that had a few more teeth in the United Nations. And I think one of the big casualties out of the process of Ukraine in particular, but generally across Africa, has been the toothless nature of the United Nations in many of these conflicts. And that's why you've seen a devolution to regional military organizations as a consequence of this. So one would hope that over time you would see more help and more assistance given by NATO to other organizations as well.
And hence there have been growing calls as well, even from South Africa, for the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations, hopefully to address that toothlessness you've just expressed there, Greg. Greg, I can't let you go. You are live to us from Lviv, which is on the border, towards the border with Poland. You are inside Ukraine, that part of it that hasn't seen much war, but has received a lot of refugees, people fleeing from the eastern side of Ukraine. What's the latest you can tell our viewers here on ENC this Monday afternoon about what's going on with the war on the ground? The South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation, just about an hour ago or so before I went on air, tweeting its concern for what it says are reports of civilian casualties coming out of Ukraine. What do you know? What's happening on the ground, Greg?
Well, as you know, the Russian forces have withdrawn from north of Kiev into defensive positions. They remain in Ukrainian territory, and Russia seems to be reinforcing its attempts to try and get its north and southern axes of advance to link them together and cut off a larger amount of territory in the east, while simultaneously really razing to the ground large cities in the south, Mariupol, Kherson, and so on. And this seems to be the way in which the war is going now. I mean, I think everybody has been stunned by the extraordinary tenacity shown by the Ukrainians in pushing the Russians back with a lot of international assistance in terms of arms and no doubt intelligence as well. But the Russian strategy seems now to be to grind it out. And by grinding it out, of course, you're going to see far greater civilian casualties, as in a place like Mariupol, which has essentially been leveled. And you're right, even Lviv to the west, which is a city normally of 700,000 people, is probably now well over 1 million in terms of its swelling by refugees, and is likely to grow even larger. And it's not untouched by the war. Every day there are air attacks, air raid sirens blaring continuously. So the war has progressed. It's taken on a different form. The Russians have not had an easy time of things at all, but they still seem adamant to try and grind this, and particularly these southern cities, down, and to grind the resistance down. And just finally, there's a cost to this, of course, that Africa's going to feel, not just in terms of human rights and our concern for human rights and the universality of human rights in these instances, but these are the principal ports through which Ukraine's grain and other exports flow. And Ukraine is in the top 5 world producers of sunflower, of winter wheat, and of corn. And a lot of that is intended for African, especially North African markets. So it poses very big questions for food security in Africa as well, which I think are likely to have an impact sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we're already feeling the impact of the oil price that it went up a few weeks ago to over $100 per barrel. Thank you very much, Greg, for your insights and your time from Lviv inside Ukraine on this 73rd anniversary of NATO, but we also took time to reflect on what's happening on the ground. He's, of course, the president of the Brent Hess Foundation. He was talking to us live from Lviv in the western part of Ukraine.